Now, a feature of this particular podcast has been to look at folklore as a source. Not necessarily, we know with folklore that there's an element of needing to maybe go a little bit further, but what we have from the Dúchas archives is the words of the school children of the 1930s, the words that they wrote down that were given to them by a previous generation for most of the part. When we research this particular area, what comes up is not Courtaparteen, but Courtaparteen. So a more phonetically accurate description of it. It's Courta, Courta, 13 with an F, Furteen. So that's kind of direct anglicisation, obviously, from the Gaeilge, Court on 13, Courta 13, where the PH makes an F sound. And in an extract from a local school, or holy wells, there is reference to Courta 13 well. And the child writing says, this is a very small well and is capable of containing about 4 gallons of water. It is situated near the graveyard on the side of a hill. It is called St. Ruan's Well, from the saint who is said to be the patron saint of the parish. Many people visit the well, which, however, is chiefly of local fame. Cures have been effected often. 3 or 4 of my companions who are suffering from warts have been miraculously cured. One boy washed his hands in the well on evening and woke up the next morning to find that not even a trace of the warts was visible on his hands. So we see reference later on to the offerings that are left behind. So we see again the importance of Tubber, of the well, in Irish society and in the local example here. But for the one that we're looking at here, we see that in the 1930s, Courta 13 well, as they called it there, or St. Ruan's Well, would have been well known to the children and the people in the locality. And the mention, of course, is that it's near the graveyard on the side of the hill. So this is the holy well that we saw on the journey. Now, the next folklore reference that we find, Accordia, is to do with old graveyards. And the person contributing this time says, there are 4 churchyards in the parish of Courses. Their names are Ringrone, Old Court, Courta 13, and Temple Latrine. Now, so again we see, rather than the complete anglicisation, I guess, of Courtaparteen, we see the use of a one that's closer to the original Irish, Courta 13. So at this point, this is regarded as an old graveyard. And it says there, 3 of these churchyards are in use, but Old Court is not now in use. So again, what do we see here from the 1930s? We see that while the Courta 13 churchyard is level and it slopes down to the east, it says here also, what do we see? We see that the old graveyard is still in use. And this is around the 1930s. Now, looking at the Dúchas archives, while I've seen entries mentioning the church in ruins, and I've seen entries mentioning the use and the importance of the well and the graveyard, we don't see any mention of ruins in terms of the village being swallowed up or the village being hidden or the village being abandoned. So this leads us to believe, coupled with the fact that the census data from 1911 show people are still living there, coupled with the fact that it's viewable from maps in the 1940s, and coupled with the fact that you see, when you look through the newspaper archives, you see the odd mention, not too much has to be said, but you see the odd mention of the village or the area. You see Courtaparteen, that particular phrase. You see it in the newspaper archives, kind of right up to the 30s and 40s occasionally. What this leads us to believe is that the village is occupied up until at least the 30s or 40s. So again, thinking back to the description of it as a hidden famine village, as I said, it's not wholly accurate. I mean, if you want to look at it from the point of view of it's a famine era village, that's true. Like I said, previously it predates the famine. From looking at maps, there's a settlement there. There's no question about it, but that people in the village and people in the surrounds would have suffered greatly during Ungurta Moor. They would have suffered from hunger. They would have suffered from economic pressures of the time. They would have, almost certainly have, experienced forced emigration. And there's no question about it, but that the area, like the area surrounding it, suffered massively economically. And we only have to look at some of the dramatic population fall in the greater area to see that was a fact. So it's just a bit too simplistic to describe it simply as a famine village. And it's also worth noting that while, we look at it now and we see the ruins and we see that, life must have been tough and life must have been difficult for a village so close to the cliff edge at a very economically trying time. It's also worth mentioning in terms of the standard of accommodation that during Ungurta Moor, if we're focusing on that particular time, the vast majority of people on the island would have been living in even inferior accommodation still. Essentially mud huts and clachans, and really, when we look back on it and we see the pictures, it's difficult to imagine, what life was like and the difficulty that people would have experienced. But Accordia, it does give us the opportunity, perhaps, to explore a little bit further what life would have been like here and in the surrounding areas during Ungurta Moor. And this particular village, if we think back to the start when we were trying to find it on the maps, we found it lashly, halfway between the old head of Kinsale, Kiontoila, and a place called Sandy Cove. And if we look at the Dúchas archives, the same ones that told us about the church, and the same ones that told us about the well, the Tuber Nefa, there's an entry about famine times. And it absolutely blew me sideways. So we think about Sandy Cove, the village just to the north of Courtaparteen. And it says the Great Irish Famine occurred in the years 1846 and 47. Now again, this is a child writing in the 1930s, being informed by somebody else, and we probably would look at that and see it lasting from 45 to maybe 53. It was caused by the blight that destroyed the potato crop in 1845. Before the famine, the horrors of the famine came about, the village of Sandyco was very thickly populated. So now this is the village that we saw on the map, literally just north of Courtaparteen. Rows of houses extended in various directions on both sides of the local river. The remains of actual terraces can clearly be traced, where a few solitary cottages are now to be seen. The population must certainly have been about 500 people. However, the rigours of the famine soon began to tell its story in this prosperous fishing village. The poor inhabitants bore out their lot for a long time, depending for subsistence on the meagre 4 pence a day relief schemes which were being carried on. Now I'll stop there for a second. So this is exactly what I suppose the title on the Google Maps kind of leads us to believe. So here we have it just north of Courtaparteen. We have the Dúchas archives, which yes is folklore, telling us about the experience of the village right next to Courtaparteen, right to the north of it, during Ungurta Moor. And we learned that the village was thickly populated. It was a seafaring village. It was a fishing village. There were rows and rows of houses extended in various directions on both sides of the local river. And now, with this child writing in the 1930s, says the remains of actual terraces can be clearly traced, where a few solitary cottages are now to be seen. So what we see there is typical of what would have happened in so many towns and villages and settlements around Ireland during Ungurta Moor, during Undrochael, where the people obviously in the most tragic incidents died of starvation or disease, and in other tragic occurrences led to forced emigration. Now, this particular entry goes on then to talk about some of the relief schemes, and it's worth mentioning those. says the cutting of some local roads, the building of the inner pier at Kinsale, at Cuntoila. When these schemes were completed, the people were in a desperate condition. So basically, at one point or another, there were two relief schemes here. One was building roads, the kind of roads in many senses that led to nowhere. And the other one was building the inner pier at Kinsale, at Cuntoila. And I've actually seen the advertisements for those in the newspaper archives, which is it does give you a feeling when you look back on it and you think about the difficulty and the challenges that people would have gone through working on those schemes with literally empty bellies. And also, I can't help but contrast, you think about the pier at Kinsale now, down around that area. If you were to go down there on a random weekend, particularly around the summer, you'll see an awful lot of wealth. You'll see, yachts. And I know in the last couple of years, there's been super yachts arriving there, the super rich and the super wealthy. And I can't help but feel that kind of contrast with the fact that this, the inner pier at Cuntoila, and I think the one at World's End as well, I'm not sure about that. I think those were built, with essentially famine labour. These people who were destitute, they had been driven from their land in previous generations. They had existed in a situation where they were reliant on the potato as a wage crop, basically. And that when that, disastrous economic situation, which was enforced on this country by the colonial power, when that eventually fell apart in the house of cards that it was, these were the people then that suffered the greatest brunt of it. And even in their desperation as they starved, what were they doing? They were put to work, for very poor wages and for food that would not even replace the calories they had expended in work in many cases. And what they ended up doing, I suppose nowadays we look at it and we see, the contrast with the super yachts and the super rich, using these particular things. There's like an echo of history there, which I find it difficult to describe in terms of words, but just it's something that really impacts me when I think about that. And so back to the Dúchas archives. This particular entry has told us what life was like for the people, the inhabitants of Sandy Cove. It's told us that when the child is writing in the 1930s, many of, all that's left, some of the terraces have completely gone. There's the remnants of them, but all that's left is a couple of coffins. And going back to a question we asked at the start of the podcast, where did all the people go? And that particular entry goes on to talk about a number embarking from America. So it says it is related that 60 families left the village one morning and boarded a large sailing vessel at Tyler's Quay, whence they sailed for America. So, at the start of this entry, the child is talking about how all that remains of much of the terraces are, ruins as such, and only a few cottages. Mention then, where did the people go? Well, this is obviously folklore, but it's been passed on to this child that 60 families left the village one morning and boarded a large sailing vessel at Tyler's Quay and sailed for America. Of that wretched crossing, little definite information has come to us, but we may be sure that pestilence and probably death set in before the shores of that far-off land came into sight. But this is only one instance of the wretchedness. The cause of all of the trouble was the failure of the potato crop, which was chief support of the people. So I was talking there about a wage crop, that's what you're talking about. The potatoes rotted in the ground. This can be proved in many places. For instance, on Sandy Cove Island, one may clearly distinguish the long rows of ridges. From this we conclude that the potatoes were never dug. People ate fish and turnips and a piece of black bread if they were lucky enough to get it. One curious fact was that the corn crop was excellent with all the local farmers those few years, but the English government demanded that this corn be sent across to pay the rent. And there we see the forced extraction, essentially, of food at the time of what was called famine. And this is why I, along with other people, and I mention it probably out of habit at times, but that's why I've got such a difficulty with calling this a famine. It's the absence of one particular foodstuff, but you have a situation where many other foodstuffs are being exported and taken from the country at the same time. Hence, the poor people had no bread, owing to the decay of potatoes in every corner of the countryside and the numerous pitiful deaths on the roadside. Now, just think about that for a second. The numerous pitiful deaths on the roadside. Terrible sickness called famine fever set in and ravaged the countryside. So we started out kind of looking at this particular village of Courtaparteen, and we looked what was said on Google Maps about it and the fact that it was described as a famine era, hidden famine era village, which conjures up the kind of images that we just saw there. But that particular reference is in reference to Sandy Cove, a village just north of Courtaparteen. And like I said, that would have been standard for most places across the country, particularly in the south and particularly in the west, not exclusively, but particularly in those areas. So it serves, while we may have lack of information around Courtaparteen around the time of that, you can be sure that some of the conditions that were explained and described there at Sandy Cove in the Dúchas archives would have extended to Courtaparteen as well. Acharja, I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Undercover Irish. It was an absolute privilege to put it together. I hope you enjoyed it, listening to it as much as I enjoyed the construction of the episode and the research that went into this particular episode. If you have enjoyed it and you would like to contribute to the research and the upkeep of this episode, please do consider supporting my work on Patreon or Patreon. I'd be very, very thankful, and feeling harava buiach, as I'd say in Irish, I'd be more than thankful to you if you'd consider supporting my work. Please do follow on Instagram, Acharja, and if you enjoyed this particular episode, please do share it with a friend, share it in a WhatsApp group, send it to your friends, help get the word out about this particular podcast. Give it a like or a review on wherever you listen to this episode. It would mean the world to me, Acharja, and it would make a huge difference in trying to publicise and get this particular podcast out through the algorithms. So Acharja dílis, gurv míle mahagat asocht fellum. Thank you so much for being with me on this episode. Berigi bua agus slán go fóil Acharja.